Hello, today is day 5 of Unit 2. Our revolutionary idea of today is abolitionism. That is the decision to abolish or end slavery and or to abolish and end the slave trade. Our first question is about Olida Equiano. Usually people just call him Equiano. And why was he so influential? So the first question is, who is he? He was a member of the Igbo district, born in a place called Benin today. The name is here, but it's actually over here where this line is. He was born in around 1745 in an agricultural town, but his father was an important leader and a part of law enforcement. There were periodic problems with other towns nearby and other districts. They had been dealing with some problems with locusts and wars in his childhood. And so there were wars and captives and things like this happening. It was not necessarily a peaceful time. In his childhood, he and his sister were kidnapped. He was sold into slavery and brought on a boat over here to Barbados. Then he was sold to a different master who sold him to a different master who was a ship's member of the Royal Navy, and then someone else who was a ship's captain who brought him on journeys all around the Atlantic. This picture here represents, merchants' ships docking at various places around the Atlantic and even the Mediterranean. Then later in life, he was able to save money to purchase his freedom, and he moved to London where he wrote his life's story. His autobiography is one of the main ways that abolitionists strove to publicize how horrible slavery was. One excerpt from his interesting narrative of the life is here. It says, "One day when all our people were gone out to their work as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls and in a moment seized us both. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could, till night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep, which allayed our misfortune for a short time. After that, he was separated from his sister and sold to a wealthy African man who treated him relatively well, but through a series of unfortunate events, he accidentally kills a chicken and he gets scared and he runs away and then he gets caught and then he gets sold to some slave traders who bring him to the coast. This is what he says about that. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived at the coast was the sea and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were found by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair, and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief." This may have been the first time he had ever seen the ocean, and it's one of the first times he had ever seen people with white or light-skinned complexions. White skin and light complexions were associated in many West African cultures with the dead and with like ghosts or people in the afterlife. And so seeing people with light complexions would sort of help to contribute to this feeling that they're going to transport him to hell or that they're going to kill him, or, much like someone today, if zombies came and tried to take you prisoner, it would be a terrifying experience. He goes on, "In a little time after, amongst the poor chained men, I found some of my own nation, which in a small degree gave ease to my mind. I inquired of these what was to be done with us. They gave me to understand that we were to be carried in these white people's country, to work for them. I then was a little revived and thought if it were no worse than working, my situation was not so desperate. But still I feared I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty, and this not only shown towards us blacks, but also to some of the whites themselves. This was on the boat to Barbados, although he wouldn't have known where he was headed at the time. And to him, slavery was familiar. If it were no worse than working, he was fine with this. But this kind of cruelty was a new thing. And he assumes that the white people are so brutal, they must be cannibals. This is from when they arrive near Barbados. At last we came in sight of the island of Barbados, at which the whites on board gave a great shout and made many signs of joy to us. We did not know what to think of this, but as the vessel drew nearer, we plainly saw the harbor and other ships of different kinds and sizes, and we soon anchored amongst them off Bridgetown. Many merchants and planters now came on board, though it was in the evening. They put us in separate parcels and examined us attentively. They also made us jump and pointed to the land, signifying that we were to go there. We thought by this that we should be eaten by these ugly men, as they appeared to us, when soon after we were all put down under the deck again, there was much dread and trembling among us, and nothing but bitter cries to be heard all the night from these apprehensions, insomuch that at last the white people got some old slaves from the land to pacify us. They told us we were not to be eaten, but to work, and were soon to go on land, where we should see many of our country people. After he leaves the boat, where the slave traders made them jump as a test of their physical fitness, then he was brought sold to a plantation owner, and then later sold to a series of different masters. As a slave to a Royal Naval officer, and then later to a slave to a merchant on a ship. The scene of the port would become familiar to him. And then later in his life, after he had learned English and had spent time working for a merchant on a ship where he learned some reading and some writing and things like this, he was able to earn slowly enough money to purchase his own freedom. He would buy trinkets in one port, and then when they went to the next place, he would sell them for a profit, buying a few more things, and then sell them for a profit in the next place. After saving up enough money, he was able to purchase his own freedom for about 30 pounds sterling, and he continued to journey around a little bit more, eventually moving to London, where, as a free person, he started an organization known as the Sons of Africa. The Sons of Africa, in 1787, petitioned the government repeatedly for the end of African slavery. They did not succeed. However, Parliament did pass a law in 1788 to regulate the capacity of ships. So you may have seen drawings like this before. This is the new regulation that the Sons of Africa managed to pass. And this is the new, less crowded version of a slave ship that happened because of his hard work. The next question seems to jump quite a bit, and so it requires a little bit of background. Why were the Coromantee Wars so violent? So for a period of time in the early 1700s, the British were fighting a series of wars called the Coromantee Wars. What were they? Why were they? This is going to require us to go backwards in time to figure it out. So this takes us all the way back to Africa and the Ashanti Empire, which is located on the west coast of Africa right about here. The Ashanti start out as a small empire in the 1500s, and then they trade with the Portuguese in mostly gold. This area is known subsequently as the Gold Coast by Europeans, and so that makes sense. They sold gold to the Portuguese in exchange for guns, and then later they end up selling slaves as well. They used those guns to enlarge their empire by conquering the neighboring nations, and they sold some of those neighboring nations' people into slavery. By the time we get to 1717, the Ashanti Empire is just that. It's an empire, and it's led by a king or emperor, depending on how you want to translate it, whose power is signified by the golden stool. This is the stool here. It's a little confusing because the stool tipped sideways, sitting on a chair. But this is a similar type of style of stool sitting upright, so you can understand what it is. The king/emperor of the Ashanti had tremendous power and was able to use that power to continue to grow his power, much like absolute rulers in Europe at this same time, such as the King of France, Louis XIV, or Empress Maria Theresa of the Habsburg Empire. Ashanti warriors, like this individual here in the middle, were very well armed, very well trained, and they basically participated in nearly 100 years of continuous warfare to expand and secure the Ashanti Empire. The Ashanti warriors were very familiar with the latest weapons technology, guns that they had purchased from European traders. And I want to point out that this is not a nose piercing. This is a knife in his mouth. You want to think of Ashanti soldiers as like Marines or special forces. They're very well trained and very terrifying. In their wars, they are capturing and fighting against the soldiers from neighboring nations. Those neighboring nations are capturing Ashanti soldiers, and they are capturing the soldiers of neighboring nations. And then those individuals are the ones who are getting sold to slave traders in the Bight of Benin. When Ashanti enslaved people, or Akan-speaking enslaved people from the area around the Ashanti Empire, arrive in the Americas, they are called Coromantee by the British. This is a name that's just given to them. It's based on one of the ports where they are purchased. So the British end up fighting wars against the Coromantee, which is just another word for the Akan people of this whole region. And these Coromantee/Akan/Ashanti warriors would rise up and rebel against their slave masters again and again, especially in places like Jamaica. The Jamaican planters went out of their way to purchase Coromantee workers because they thought they were stronger and better workers. But this also was because they were stronger and better fighters. The Akan speakers were used to war. They were good at fighting, and many of them were even of royal lineage, and when they were captured in wars, became natural leaders for the slave rebellions. They already knew how to use swords and knives and close combat. They also were trained and skilled in the use of firearms, as they had experience for many years of war. These rebellions happened over and over and over again, and the British increasingly used torture and terror tactics to try to discourage rebellion. Each rebellion that was put down seemed to only inspire further rebellion, and these rebellions and wars became more violent over time. A quick rundown of some of these rebellions. In 1690, 300 Akan enslaved people rebelled in Jamaica. In 1731, there was the beginning of what were called the Maroon Wars amongst people who had freed themselves from slavery and had developed their own towns in Jamaica. In 1733, 150 Akan rebels in St. John's Island fought the white slave owners. In 1736, an individual named Prince Claus led a rebellion in Antigua. He was also Akan. In 1741, in New York City, there was an Akan conspiracy to burn down New York City. They were caught after they burnt down 3 buildings, but still, this shows us how far the threat spread. In 1760, there was a war known as Tacky's War, where much of Jamaica was taken over in the name of creating an African empire for most of a year before they were put down by the combined forces of the British, French, and Swiss militaries. In 1763, there was another uprising, so forth and so on, all the way through to the Baptist Wars in Jamaica. And so why were these wars so violent? Well, all of these reasons. You have trained soldiers who come from a culture of warfare generation after generation, where those prisoners of war are sold into slavery, and those enslaved people had a tradition of fighting and working together to fight and developing plans to fight. And many of the enslaved people were high-level, high-ranking leaders in their own right, and so had leadership skills in addition to fighting skills. So far, we've talked about abolitionists who are enslaved people, Equiano, who was enslaved and got his freedom, the Coromantee, various groups of people who were enslaved and fought for their freedom. The question students ask is, were there any abolitionists who were not enslaved people? And the answer is, of course, yes, there were some. And I'd like to talk a little bit about one example, Benjamin Lay. Benjamin Lay was a 4 foot tall, or 4 foot 7 inches tall Quaker. He was what we would call today a little person. He also had maybe scoliosis or something like that. Back then, they called him a hunchback. In the 1720s, he worked as a merchant in Barbados. He saw firsthand the brutality of the sugar plantations and the way that enslaved people were treated. He started a crusade to try to end slavery that eventually would make all the members of the Quaker religion into abolitionists. And if you know the rest of US history in the future, Quakers are going to be some of the most activist abolitionists in US history, all the way through into things like the Civil War and the Underground Railroad. He is the one who inspired the Quakers to become abolitionists in the first place. He did a bunch of anti-slavery theatrics. He refused to wear clothes made from slave labor. He opposed tea and coffee because slave labor was used in the farming of them. And you have this drawing here of Benjamin taking his teacups and teapots out into the square and breaking them in pieces with a stick as a protest. He opposed the eating of sugar because it was a way of supporting slavery. And he also did a bunch of other protests, like standing barefoot in the snow to show the suffering of enslaved people. He even briefly kidnapped another Quaker's child to sort of illustrate the terror and trauma that would be involved in the kidnapping of a child. And one famous incident in 1738, he rigged up a hollowed out book filled with a sheep's bladder full of berry juice. And then he went into a Quaker meeting and spoke about the hypocrisy of slave owners. And he stabbed the book with a sword, spurting berry juice, fake blood all over the slave owners in the front row. He was not very popular. He was kind of an outcast. And later in his life, he ended up actually literally living in a cave. But a great victory for him in 1758, Quakers voted to exclude slaveholders from their meetings. And this, he reportedly said, meant that he could die in peace. The fourth question is, how did James Somerset use the English law courts to gain freedom from enslavement? So James Somerset is this individual here, and he was an enslaved African in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. He was purchased by a guy named Charles Stuart, which I don't have a picture of, unfortunately. In 1769, Charles Stuart brought Somerset to London, and sometime in the next couple of years, he was baptized as a Christian. He made friends with British Londoner Christians. And in 1771, Somerset escaped from slavery. Stuart had him captured and, in punishment, was going to have him shipped to Barbados to be sold into slavery on a sugar plantation. Stuart's friends and his three godparents, some white Londoners, got a lawyer named Grenville Sharp, who was an abolitionist as well. They took their case to court. They had 3 hearings, and their main case was that James Somerset had the right to habeas corpus as an English person on English soil. Habeas corpus requires that a person must be brought before a judge or court before being detained or imprisoned. We have this idea in our culture as well. It literally means show me the body, not the physical body, but like the body of laws that tell a person why they are being detained. The ruling in the various hearings was that the colonies have slavery, but England itself does not have slavery. The ruling was that English law did not allow a person to enter into a contract without their consent. Judge Lord Mansfield was very clear on this matter, and because you cannot consent to enslave yourself, there's no such thing as slavery on English soil. The argument against Somerset, so Charles Stuart's lawyer argued that this was property law, that Somerset was the property of Charles Stuart, and that you cannot confiscate a slave from their master any more than you can confiscate a cow from their owner. Also, he made the case that there were about 15,000 other enslaved Africans in England, and if you free one, then you're going to have to free them all, and that will end up in chaos. The ultimate end of the case was that Somerset was ruled to be a free individual, and that in England no man could be a slave or property, and this sort of symbol of abolitionism is adopted. Am I not a man and a brother? What this case definitively shows is that enslaved people are, in fact, people, and they are not to be judged as property, but as humans. This means that they cannot be held against their will, and that on English soil, no man can be considered a slave. So what did this Somerset case mean for the American colonies? Remember, at this time, the North American colonies, the 13 colonies, are still part of England. It's 1773, and the Somerset case is in all of the newspapers. Everybody is following with great interest what is going to happen to this poor enslaved man, Somerset, and whether he's going to be considered a man and a brother, as the picture says, or if he's going to be considered as property. Many enslaved men and women began to look at the King of England as a potential liberator because the case ruled that English law says on English soil, all men are free. African American preachers in North America, many of whom were literate, preached to their congregations that the king was about to alter the world and set the Negroes free. This led to a lot of agitation within the colonies, where individuals like Elizabeth Freeman, individuals who were enslaved, began bringing lawsuits against their masters to try to obtain freedom. In 1773 and 1774, there were many cases in the colony of Massachusetts in particular. This actually led the colonies to declare independence. Many of the colonies, especially in the southern part, Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, but also New York, had such large proportions of their population enslaved that they realized if England was heading towards emancipating all the slaves, heading towards abolishing slavery, this would mean the end of their economies. And so these southern colonies, fearing the expansion of abolitionist, free Englishmen ideas from England, started to support the idea of colonial independence, started to support the idea of declaring independence from Britain. Northern colonies, on the other hand, resented the royal decisions to make laws for them. In the northern colonies, many of these lawsuits were passed where the local judges said the enslaved person should be freed, and then the royal governors would veto this. So in the northern colonies, many people resented royal governors trying to maintain slavery and maintain slaves as property. What this means is that the British colonies, the North and the South, had opposite reasons to do so, but both were inspired by the Somerset case to move towards independence. And if you recall, the Somerset case being passed in 1773, or being ruled in 1773, led us just a few short years later, in 1776, to a declaration of independence by the American colonies. Was this a major motivator of the southern colonies moving towards independence? It's hard to know what each individual's reasons were, but we do know that many individuals like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were concerned with their property rights. Were they speaking of property rights in terms of human property? Potentially. These are our 5 questions for today. Oh boy. Looks weird. But if you can read between the weird formatting, these are the 5 questions for today. Why were the Coromantee? Who was Equiano and why was he so influential? Why were the wars so violent? Were there any, sorry about this, abolitionists who were not enslaved? How did James Somerset use law courts to gain freedom from enslavement? And then lastly, what did the Somerset ruling mean in the colonies? You can submit that to this assignment, and I will see you all tomorrow.